In addition to total cost, there are other useful measures of cost. So take for example, average cost. So take for example, if you want to open up your own business, so for example, you know, a sweatshirt factory, for example. Okay? And before you start your own business, most likely you do a little bit of research. Okay? So you probably will want to ask around, ask some of the seasoned people, experienced people in the industry. Okay? So let's say you are interviewing an expert in the industry, and you have prepared a list of questions. One of the most one of the questions that you're most likely to ask is, how much does it cost to make a sweatshirt? So by asking that question, you're not asking about total cost. You're asking about the average cost. The average cost is the cost of each typical unit of product. So how much does it cost to make or produce or sell one unit of that product? That's the average cost. When you break down the average cost into components, we can have average fixed cost, okay, which is the total fixed cost divided by the quantity of output. Be very careful here when we look at the quantity. It is the quantity of output here that is in the denominator because we're looking at a per unit output, the cost per unit output. So it's not the input, okay? Average variable cost, the total variable cost divided by the quantity of output, and then the average total cost. And sometimes we use ATC, sometimes we simply use AC. The total cost divided by the quantity of output. And then an alternative way to find the average total cost is you can sum up the average fixed cost and average variable cost. That will give you the average total cost. Okay? So I'm going to have you pause the video for about 15 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes, so that you can complete the calculation in this example. Okay? So you are given the first column, output in terms of the number of glasses of lemonade sold an hour, and then the total cost that corresponds to that. So when the stand sells one glass of lemonade in an hour, the total cost is $3.30. And that is made up of fixed cost, $3, plus variable cost, 30 cents. Okay? So let's pause the video for 10 to 15 minutes and let's complete the calculation. It is very important that you are very, very proficient with the calculations. Okay, so let's find average fixed cost, average variable cost, and average total cost. So let's try a couple, okay? A couple of examples and see where we are, okay? Okay, so let's look at the number a little bit, okay? So let's pick this. When the quantity of output is equal to 4, okay? So let's find the average fixed cost. Let's find the average variable cost and then the average total cost. Okay, so when the quantity is equal to 4, okay, let's find the average fixed cost. So that's fixed cost divided by the quantity, right? So when you look back, that's what? 4 and then 3 here, right? Okay. So 3 over 4, so that will give you 0.75, okay? 75 cents. And then let's find average variable cost. Okay. So let's go back to the table. So average variable cost, so the total variable cost is 240. Okay. The variable cost. Okay. 240 divided by 4. So that will give us 60 cents. So average total cost. Okay. There are several ways to find it. One easy way, of course, given the answer that we have found, is to sum up the average fixed cost and the average variable cost. So 0.75 75 plus 0.60. So that will give us 1.35. Okay. Alternatively, you can also use the information here. 540, that's the total cost. Okay. So 540 40 divided by 4, so that will give you 1.35. Okay, same way. Okay, so two different ways to get to the same answer. I'm gonna leave you with the answers. Okay, so if you haven't completed the calculation just now, then you definitely want to jot these down or take a picture of these numbers somewhere and put it somewhere so that you still have a chance to work on the calculation yourself. Once again, there is no way around this. It's just like math. It's always practice, practice, practice. So now, another measure of cost. So we talk about average cost just now. Okay? So if you want to open up a business, a sweatshirt factory, for example, so in addition to asking how much does it cost to produce a sweatshirt, sometimes you will ask yourself, how long do I have to open my factory? How long do I have to run my factory every day? So normally you run it for 8 hours, but some people tell you that there's a lot of business out there, so it's actually worthwhile to run your factory for 10 hours instead. So you're asking yourself whether you want to operate for another 2 hours. But obviously these 2 hours, they don't come free. To open for extra 2 hours, you have to hire workers. A lot of times you have to pay workers overtime, which is more than the regular rate. And then you still have to, take into consideration the extra electricity, fuel that you have to use, and so on and so forth. So you have to do the calculation, how many more sweatshirts can you produce in those two extra 2 hours. In addition to that, you will ask yourself, how much extra does it cost me to run the factory for additional 2 hours? Okay, so let's say um, you will produce 100 more sweatshirts in those 2 hours, 100 extra, okay, extra sweatshirts. and then it will cost you $1,000 more to operate for another 2 hours. So then you will ask yourself, is it worth it, to spend additional $1,000 to produce 100 sweatshirts? So that $1,000 is actually the additional cost, the marginal cost to produce another 100 sweatshirts. Okay, so sometimes you ask that questions. Okay, how much does it cost to produce an additional unit of output? Okay, so this is how we calculate the marginal cost. Is a change in total cost divided by the change in quantity of output. Essentially, it's asking how much more does it cost to produce additional units of output. Okay, so let's look at some calculation. Oops. Okay. So look at this calculation here. Okay. So we have I'm sorry. Go back. So you can see the first column that gives us the amount of output in terms of the number of glasses of laminate sold in an hour, and then the corresponding total cost. Okay, so as you can see, if the stand sells nothing, it will have to pay $3. That's the total cost. If it sells one glass of laminates, that's $3.30. What that means is the first glass of lemonade adds 30 cents to the total cost. So that's the marginal cost of the first glass of lemonade. And then we go from one glass to 2 glasses of lemonade. The total cost increases from $3.30 to $3.80. So that means the second glass of lemonade adds 50 cents to the total cost. So that is the marginal cost of the second glass of lemonade. Okay. So when you put it in formulas, so when the company sells only one glass of lemonade, okay, so marginal cost of the first glass of lemonade is the change in the cost, which is $3.30 minus $3, okay, divided by what? Okay. The change in the quantity, 1 minus 0, okay? So that will give us 30 cents, right? And then if you want to go for the second glass of lemonade, okay, the marginal cost of the second glass of lemonade is what? 380 minus 330. And then 2 minus 1. So that will give us what? 50 cents. Okay, so that's how much the second glass of lemonade adds to the total production. So you can see that as the quantity of output increases, the total cost increases, which is not, which is not counterintuitive, which is quite intuitive, right? So as the total cost increases, as the quantity of output increases, the total cost increases. So we have an upward sloping total cost curve. But what is worth mentioning is the slope of the total cost. You can see that it is not a straight line. In fact, the slope actually increases at an increasing rate. The slope increases with the quantity of output. So what does the slope represent? So rise over run, right? Take any 2 points, okay? Rise over run. So the vertical distance represents a change in the total cost, and the horizontal distance represents a change in the output. So simply put, the slope of the total cost curve is the marginal cost. So what we see here is as the quantity of output increases, the marginal cost increases. So not all laminate is created equal. The later batch of laminate is actually more expensive to produce because the marginal cost increases. Okay, so as you can see, the 10th glass of laminate adds $2.10 to the total cost, whereas the first glass of laminate adds only 30 cents to the marginal cost. So what we observe here is increasing marginal cost. Okay? So increasing marginal cost. Okay? So why do we have increasing marginal cost? Well, okay, it's because of the diminishing marginal product. Okay? So let's recall the law of diminishing marginal product. It simply means the more inputs we have, holding everything else constant, the more inputs we have, as long as we have at least one type of fixed inputs, okay, the marginal product declines eventually. So subsequent inputs are less productive than the previous inputs. So what happens here is as the stand keeps increasing the amount of output in an hour, okay, so it is bound to increase the number of workers, for example. So initially, okay, so we have a fixed input. Let's say the machine, okay, so the laminate, the juicer, okay. So initially we have one workers, which is fine, works with one or two laminate machines, okay. And then now we have two workers working on two machines, two laminate machines, still fine. But as we increase the amount of output, the laminate that we sell, we need to have more and more workers. So we end up with, 5 or 6 workers in a tiny little stand. They have to take a long, long time to wait for their turn to use the machine, the laminate. So each additional worker we hire is actually can actually make less laminate than the previous one. In order to make up for that, in order to produce more output in an hour, we need to have more workers, okay? Because these workers are not as productive as the previous one. So as a result, we have increasing marginal cost. So that is due to the law of diminishing marginal returns. Okay? So that brings us to get familiar with some of the typical looking curve. Okay? So first, let's look at the marginal cost curve. So because of increasing marginal cost, we typically have an upward sloping marginal cost. So as we increase the amount of output, the marginal cost increases eventually, if not in the beginning, but eventually. So we have an upward sloping marginal cost. Okay? And then we always have a downward sloping average fixed cost. So why do we have a downward sloping average fixed cost? Well, it is simply a mathematical result. Okay, a fixed amount of cost is spread over an increasingly larger amount of output. So fixed cost is fixed, right? Okay, so when you look at average total cost, average fixed cost, that's fixed cost divided by quantity of output. So fixed cost is fixed. It is a constant. Okay, so it doesn't change. Okay, and then quantity keep increasing. Okay, so mathematically, when you have a numerator that doesn't change, and the denominator that keeps becoming larger, then the whole term will become smaller. So that's why we have a downward sloping average fixed cost. We always have a downward sloping average fixed cost. Okay, and then let's turn to the average total cost. You can see that this is almost like a U shape, not exactly like a U shape, but almost like a U shape. Okay, so initially it is downward sloping. That's because that's because of the effect of a downward sloping average fixed cost. Remember, average total cost is made up of average fixed cost and average variable cost. So as variable as average fixed cost declines, okay, with the output, the average total cost also declines with the output. But at some point, another component of the average total cost, which is the average variable cost, starts to take over. So you can see that this effect dominates after some point. So that's why the average total cost starts to go up. Okay, so that's how we get a U-shaped, typical looking average total cost. So the average total cost is U-shaped. Okay, at very low levels of output, average total cost is high because fixed cost is spread over only a few units. Average total cost declines as output increases in the beginning. Average total cost starts rising because average variable cost rises substantially. Okay, so and then okay, let's look at okay, I don't know how to get rid of the average fixed cost, so let's ignore it for the moment. Let's look at the average total cost, okay, and the marginal cost, okay. So a few things that we can observe, okay. So first is how the marginal cost is related to the average total cost. As you can see, when the marginal cost is below the average total cost, the average total cost comes down, okay, decreases with the output. As the marginal cost is higher than the average total cost, the average total cost increases, okay? Which, could be quite difficult to understand. So one easier way to understand is to draw an analogy between this and our academic performance. So every semester you have your semester GPA, okay? Your semester GPA. You can think of your semester GPA as marginal cost because that actually adds to the total performance that you have had so far. And then we have our CGPA, okay, which is accumulated, throughout the semesters. So you can see that as your average total cost. Okay? So that's on average how you perform. So when your GPA, semester GPA, is lower than your CGPA, what happens? Okay, so let's say this is your last semester. You have developed this so-called senior syndrome, right? you don't really care anymore. You skip classes because it's the last semester, what the heck, right? So you skip classes, so you don't do so well in the semester. So your semester GPA is 3.0, whereas your CGPA is 3.5. Normally you do quite well, it's 3.5, okay? So this semester, not so well. So 3.0, okay? So what happens to your CGPA then? What happens to your average then? It comes down, right? Okay, so that's why we get this declining average total cost when the marginal cost is less than the average total cost. Okay, so let's say, the other case, your CGPA is 3.5, okay, and this semester, you love economics, you study very hard, you do very well, so this semester you actually, get 4.0, okay. So your marginal cost is higher than the average total cost. So what happens to your CGPA then? What happens to your CGPA? It pulls up, right? So that's how we get this increasing average total cost. So that's the relationship between marginal cost and average total cost. Okay? Let me get this thing here. Whenever marginal cost is less than average total cost is falling. Whenever marginal cost is greater than average total cost is rising. Okay? So another thing that is worth mentioning is the bottom of the U-shaped average total cost curve occurs at the quantity that minimizes average total cost. Okay? So obviously, the bottom of the U-shape is the lowest average total cost. Okay? So this is the lowest average total cost, the minimum average total cost, somewhere here, right? Okay, and then not surprisingly, it occurs at the cross between marginal cost and average total cost. So this here is the minimum average total cost, okay? Okay. And then the quantity that corresponds to this minimum average total cost, the quantity of output is called the efficient scale, okay? Let me bring this, the efficient scale, okay? So efficient scale is a quantity of output that minimizes the average total cost, okay? So when you look at it one more time, okay, every time the marginal cost cross over the average total cost, then that cross there is the minimum average total cost, okay? Okay, all right? So the marginal cost curve crosses the average total cost at the efficient scale. Once again, the efficient scale is a quantity that minimizes average total cost.